The rope stretched taut against the coral limestone, a hemp lifeline anchored to what remained of a banyan tree at the edge of Hacksaw Ridge. From his position 50 feet below the cliff face, Desmond Doss could hear the wounded calling through the smoke and shellfire above. American voices, some strong, others fading into whispers that barely carried over the thunder of Japanese mortars. The morning had started with intelligence reports suggesting light resistance on the eastern approach to the ridge. Mop-up duty, Lieutenant Morrison had called it during the pre-dawn briefing, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed reconnaissance reports. The 77th Infantry Division had been grinding forward across Okinawa for weeks, and this particular section of ridge looked no different from a dozen others they'd already cleared. But Hacksaw Ridge had been different from the moment they crested the slope. The Japanese had honeycombed the cliff face with caves and tunnels, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned the plateau into a killing ground. When Doss's company reached the top at sunrise, they walked directly into a trap that had been months in preparation. Mortars bracketed their position within seconds. Machine guns opened from concealed positions among the coral outcroppings. Half the platoon fell in the first minute of contact. Now, 4 hours later, the survivors had pulled back to regroup below the ridge, leaving their wounded scattered across the plateau above. Standard operating procedure. Tactical withdrawal. Preserve combat effectiveness for the next assault. But Doss had counted the voices during the retreat. At least 12 men still alive up there, maybe more, trapped between the cliff edge and enemy positions they couldn't see. The rope had been his idea, salvaged from a destroyed supply drop and rigged to the banyan tree's massive roots. Thick hemp, designed for cargo, not men. But it reached the plateau, and it held weight, and that made it the only connection between the wounded above and the aid station below. "You planning to climb that thing again?" Private Chen asked, checking the tension where the rope disappeared over the cliff edge. Doss wiped coral dust from his hands, feeling the raw burns where the hemp had chewed through his gloves. 7 trips up and down, 7 wounded men lowered to safety on stretchers, improvised from rifles and ponchos. Each descent had tested the rope's limits, stretching the fibers until he could see daylight through the core. As long as it holds, and if it doesn't, the question hung between them, unanswered. Chen had been with the company only 2 weeks, a replacement fresh from stateside training, who still asked direct questions about things veterans had learned not to discuss. The rope would hold or it wouldn't. The wounded above would live or die. Some calculations were too simple and too terrible for conversation. From the aid station 30 yards down the slope, Doc Williams called out, "Doss, we need you down here." The doctor's voice carried exhaustion and something approaching desperation. The aid station, nothing more than a canvas tarp stretched between 2 shattered palm trees, overflowed with casualties from the morning's assault. Men lay on stretchers, on ponchos, directly on the muddy ground. Williams moved between them with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had run out of morphine an hour ago and was rationing bandages like ammunition. But Doss's attention stayed fixed on the plateau above. Through gaps in the smoke drifting across the cliff face, he could see khaki uniforms scattered among the coral boulders, a helmet glinting in the harsh Okinawan sun, an arm moving weakly, signaling for help that might never come. "Just one more," he whispered to himself, the phrase that had become his prayer and his curse. Just one more. Chen grabbed his shoulder as he reached for the rope again. The lieutenant said to hold position. "No more solo climbs until we get artillery support. Artillery won't help the men bleeding up there right now. Neither will you if that rope snaps halfway up the cliff." For a moment, Doss felt the weight of reasonable fear pressing against unreasonable faith. Chen was right about the rope. It showed clear signs of failure, outer strands separated, core fibers stretched beyond safe limits. He was right about the orders too. Lieutenant Morrison had been explicit. No more individual rescue attempts until they could suppress the enemy positions long enough for a coordinated evacuation. But the voices above continued calling for help, and Doss had learned something about himself during the long morning on Hacksaw Ridge. He could hear those voices from 50 feet away, through shellfire and smoke, through the rational arguments of tired officers and the sensible fear of fellow soldiers. He could hear them, and once heard, he couldn't pretend they might stop on their own. The rope felt different in his hands now, softer, more flexible, where the individual strands had begun to part. Like everything else about this war, it was breaking down under stress, becoming something improvised and uncertain, but it still reached the plateau, and men were still dying up there, and the arithmetic of conscience was simpler than the arithmetic of tactics. "Tell the lieutenant I'll be back in 20 minutes, Doss said, beginning his 8th climb toward the ridge. Behind him, Chen's voice carried a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "What if you're not? If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters." The rope burned through what remained of Doss's gloves as he pulled himself over the lip of Hacksaw Ridge for the 8th time that day. The plateau stretched before him like a moonscape. Coral limestone churned into powder by hours of shelling, scattered equipment marking where his company had been caught in the open, and beyond it all, the dark mouths of caves where Japanese machine gunners waited with the patience of spiders. Sergeant Morrison lay behind a shattered tree stump 40 yards from the cliff edge, conscious but unable to move. Shrapnel from a knee mortar had punctured his chest, and every breath bubbled pink foam between his lips. He watched Doss approach with eyes that held equal measures of hope and embarrassment. "Didn't think you'd come back," Morrison whispered when Doss reached his position. "Heard Chen telling everyone the rope was done for. Rope's got one more trip in it." "How can you tell?" Doss ran his hands along Morrison's chest, checking the field dressing he'd applied during an earlier visit. The wound was serious, but not immediately fatal, if they could get him to the aid station within the hour. If the rope held, if the Japanese gunners in the caves continued their pattern of firing just close enough to terrify without actually hitting their targets. "I can't tell," Doss admitted. "I just hope." Morrison managed something between a laugh and a cough. "Hope. Christ, Doss, you're about the only man on this ridge still running on hope." As if summoned by the comment, a burst of machine gun fire stitched across the ground 20 feet away, sending coral chips spinning through the smoke. But the shots came high again, deliberately missing. For the past 4 hours, the Japanese had been doing that, firing close enough to pin the Americans in place, but not quite close enough to kill. As if they too were curious about the unarmed medic who kept appearing on their ridge. Doss helped Morrison into a sitting position, preparing to rig the improvised harness that would allow him to lower another wounded man to safety. But Morrison grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "There's something you need to know about the rope." "What about it?" "I've been watching you climb it all morning. Each time you come up, more strands are broken, but it's not just from the weight." Morrison pointed toward a coral outcropping 50 yards away, where the barrel of a Japanese machine gun was barely visible in the shadows. "They could cut that rope any time they wanted. One burst and you'd fall with whoever you're carrying." The revelation settled over Doss like a cold wind. He'd been so focused on the mechanical limits of hemp and fiber that he hadn't considered the human element. The Japanese controlled the high ground, held clear lines of fire on the rope and the cliff edge. They'd been watching him lower wounded Americans all morning, and they'd chosen not to stop him. "Why?" he asked. Morrison's eyes drifted toward the cave mouths where enemy soldiers waited in the darkness. "Maybe they think what you're doing is crazy enough to be sacred. Maybe they're just curious how long you'll keep trying, or maybe they're waiting for you to bring up someone more important than a busted-up sergeant." Another mortar shell exploded somewhere behind them, close enough to shower them with coral dust, but far enough away to feel like another warning. The Japanese weren't trying to kill him. They were letting him work. The thought should have been comforting, But it carried its own terrible weight. His safety depended on the forbearance of men he'd been trained to think of as enemies, and their tolerance might end at any moment. Every trip up the rope was a test of mercy he couldn't understand and couldn't control. "How many more are up here?" Doss asked, helping Morrison to his feet. "At least 5 that I've seen moving. Probably more in the shell holes toward the far end. 5 more wounded Americans scattered across a plateau controlled by Japanese soldiers who could cut his lifeline with a single burst of gunfire. 5 more trips up and down a rope that was already showing signs of failure. 5 more tests of whatever strange understanding existed between him and the enemy gunners watching from the caves." As Doss rigged the rope harness around Morrison's chest, the sergeant grabbed his arm again. "You don't have to keep doing this. You've already gotten more men off this ridge than anyone thought possible." "I know. So why?" Doss checked the knots, tested the rope's tension one more time. Below them, 50 feet down the cliff face, Doc Williams and his corpsmen waited with stretchers and plasma bottles, ready to catch whatever he sent down. Above them, in caves carved into coral limestone, Japanese soldiers waited with machine guns and mortars, holding fire for reasons he couldn't fathom, because they're still calling for help. He began lowering Morrison towards safety, hand over hand, feeling each strand of hemp stretch and groan under the weight. Halfway down, he heard voices calling from the far end of the plateau. American voices, growing weaker but still audible through the smoke and distant shell fire. When the rope came back up empty, Doss turned toward those voices and began walking across the most dangerous ground on Okinawa, trusting in the mercy of enemies who had every reason to kill him and no reason to let him live. The rain started during Doss's 9th trip to the plateau, turning the coral dust into slippery mud and making every handhold on the cliff face treacherous. From his position in a shell crater near the eastern edge of Hacksaw Ridge, he could see 3 more wounded men scattered among the limestone outcroppings, 2 Americans who'd been caught in the initial assault, and something that made his blood run cold. Private Henderson, barely 19 years old, sat propped against a coral boulder with both legs shattered by mortar fire. But 10 feet away from him, partially hidden behind fallen rock, a Japanese soldier lay motionless in the mud. The enemy soldier was young, maybe Henderson's age, with a bullet wound in his shoulder that had bled through his uniform jacket. His rifle lay several yards away, thrown clear when he'd fallen. For the past hour, Doss had watched the wounded Japanese fighter drift in and out of consciousness, occasionally trying to crawl toward better cover, but lacking the strength to move more than a few feet. "Don't even think about it," Henderson called out when he saw Doss looking toward the enemy soldier. "He was trying to kill us 6 hours ago. He's wounded. He's the enemy." The distinction that should have been clear felt complicated on a plateau where Japanese gunners had spent the morning deliberately missing their shots, where enemy soldiers could have cut his rope but chose not to. Doss had come to Hacksaw Ridge with firm ideas about right and wrong, about American and Japanese, about who deserved saving and who didn't. The ridge was teaching him that war made everything more complicated than training suggested. Rain drummed against his helmet as he worked his way toward Henderson, staying low to avoid the machine gun positions he knew were watching from the caves. The rope hung behind them, slick with water, its frayed ends barely visible through the downpour. Each time he'd climbed it today, more strands had separated. Chen had been right. The hemp was failing, one fiber at a time. "How bad are your legs?" he asked Henderson. "Bad enough. I'm not walking off this ridge." Doss examined the injuries, applying fresh field dressings where he could. Both femurs were fractured, but the wounds weren't bleeding heavily enough to be immediately fatal. Henderson would survive the trip down, assuming the rope held for one more descent. "What about him?" Henderson nodded toward the wounded Japanese soldier. "What about him? You going to leave him here to die?" The question carried more weight than Henderson probably intended. For the past 9 hours, Doss had been operating on pure instinct. Climb the rope, find the wounded, lower them to safety, repeat. But the sight of an enemy soldier bleeding in the mud forced him to confront the arithmetic of conscience that he'd been avoiding all day. He had medical training, he had supplies, he had a rope that might last one more trip, maybe two if they were careful with the weight. And he had a wounded 19-year-old Japanese fighter who would die without help, just like the wounded 19-year-old American sitting 10 feet away. "I don't know," Doss admitted. Rain continued falling, washing the coral dust from their uniforms and turning the plateau into a slick expanse of mud and broken rock. Somewhere in the caves above them, Japanese soldiers waited with weapons that could end this rescue operation at any moment. Below them, Doc Williams and his corpsmen struggled with an aid station that had been overwhelmed hours ago. And between those two realities, Doss faced a choice that his training had never adequately prepared him for. "The rope's almost gone," Henderson said quietly. "If you try to take both of us down, it might not hold." "I know. And if you take him first, I might be dead by the time you climb back up." "I know that too." Henderson studied the wounded Japanese soldier, who had regained consciousness and was watching them with dark, fever-bright eyes. "What would you do if I weren't here? If it was just him?" The honest answer came without hesitation. He'd rig a harness and lower the wounded enemy soldier to safety, just like he'd done for every wounded American on the ridge. The complications only arose when he tried to choose between them, when conscience bumped against loyalty, and both felt equally important. From the caves above came the sound of voices, Japanese soldiers calling to each other in words Doss couldn't understand. But the tone was clear enough. They were watching, waiting, making their own calculations about the strange tableau playing out on their ridge. "Maybe they'll wait," Henderson said. "Maybe they'll let you make 2 more trips. Maybe." But Doss could feel time running out like water through cupped hands. The rain was making everything more difficult. The rope was becoming slicker, the cliff face more treacherous, his own grip weaker with each trip up and down. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like his father's kept asking the question he'd been avoiding all day. "How long can you keep doing this before something inside you breaks?" He looked at Henderson, then at the wounded Japanese soldier, then at the frayed rope that connected them all to something like safety. 3 lives, 1 rope, and a decision that would stay with him long after the war ended. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope groaned under the weight of 2 men as Doss began his most dangerous descent from Hacksaw Ridge. Against every tactical principle he'd learned, against Henderson's protests and his own rational fear, he'd rigged a dual harness that held both the wounded American and the unconscious Japanese soldier in a precarious embrace 50 feet above the coral rocks below. Henderson had his arms wrapped around the enemy fighter, both men secured by an improvised arrangement of gauze strips and rifle slings that redistributed their combined weight across the failing hemp line. With each foot of descent, individual strands of rope snapped with sounds like muffled gunshots, but the core held, stretching and creaking, but refusing to break entirely. "This is insane," Henderson muttered through gritted teeth as they descended through the rain and smoke. "If we all die because you couldn't choose, nobody's dying today." But even as he said it, Doss could feel the rope changing in his hands. What had started the morning as thick, reliable hemp now felt soft and unreliable, individual fibers separating under stress that it was never designed to handle. The Japanese soldier, barely conscious but still breathing, represented the difference between a calculated risk and pure faith in something beyond his own strength. 20 feet from the bottom, a machine gun opened fire from the caves above. But instead of aiming at the 3 men hanging exposed on the cliff face, the burst went high and wide, as if the gunner was shooting at the sky rather than the Americans below. A warning, or maybe something else, A salute to whatever incomprehensible courage had led an unarmed medic to risk everything for soldiers on both sides of the war. Doc Williams and two corpsmen waited at the bottom with stretchers, their faces showing mixtures of amazement and professional concern. When the rope finally delivered its cargo to solid ground, Williams immediately began triage on both wounded men while his assistants checked Doss for injuries. "That rope's done," Williams said, glancing up at the frayed hemp line that now hung like a broken promise against the cliff face. "You make it down just in time." Doss looked at his hands, burned raw by hemp fibers, shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, but steady enough to work. Then he looked up at Hacksaw Ridge, where smoke drifted across the plateau and voices still called for help through the rain and distant shell fire. "I heard at least 2 more men up there." "Doss!" Williams grabbed his shoulder. "Look at that rope. Really look at it." The hemp line that had carried 16 wounded men to safety now showed its true condition. More than half the strands had parted completely, leaving a core that might support the weight of empty stretchers but would never hold another human being. The banyan tree that served as anchor point was starting to lean toward the cliff edge, its roots loosened by hours of constant stress. "It's finished," Williams continued. "You've done more today than any 10 men could do. Now let the artillery soften up those caves, and we'll send a full company back up tomorrow. Tomorrow might be too late for whoever's still up there. Today's definitely too late if that rope kills you halfway up the cliff." The argument made sense from every angle except the one that mattered most to Doss. Tactical sense, medical sense, even moral sense, if you calculated lives saved against lives risked and came up with reasonable numbers. But conscience operated on different mathematics, and the voices from the plateau above were growing weaker with each passing hour. Henderson, now stabilized on a stretcher with plasma flowing into his arm, reached out and caught Doss's wrist. "I was wrong about you." "How's that?" "Back at camp, we used to bet on when you'd crack. When the shooting started, when you saw real fighting, we figured the preacher boy would fold like a tent. Rain continued drumming against their helmets, washing the coral dust from their uniforms and turning everything the same muddy gray. From the aid station came the quiet sounds of medical work. Bandages being changed, morphine administered, wounded men breathing in the rhythm of those who might live to see another day. "I didn't fold?" Henderson managed something like a laugh. "Hell no. You broke something else entirely. You broke the whole damn war, at least for one afternoon." The comment stayed with Doss as he helped load Henderson's stretcher for transport to the rear aid station. Whatever he'd accomplished on Hacksaw Ridge felt less like heroism than exhaustion, less like courage than simple inability to stop while men were still suffering. The rope had held just long enough. The Japanese gunners had shown mercy he couldn't understand. And 16 wounded soldiers would live because sometimes faith proved stronger than hemp fibers and tactical doctrine. But the voices from the plateau continued calling, fainter now but still audible through the rain. And somewhere in the caves above, enemy soldiers waited with weapons and their own incomprehensible code of honor that had allowed an unarmed American medic to work on their ridge all day without interference. Doss looked up at the cliff one more time, then began walking toward the aid station where Doc Williams was already preparing for the casualties that tomorrow would bring. 3 days after the rope snapped for good, Doss sat in the battalion aid station with his hands wrapped in clean bandages, giving his official statement to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes for the after-action report. The typewriter keys clicked steadily as the colonel's aide recorded details that would eventually become part of the historical record. Numbers of casualties evacuated, enemy positions neutralized, tactical lessons learned during the assault on Hacksaw Ridge. But the real story, the one that would stay with Doss long after the medals and citations were forgotten, had nothing to do with the official account being typed into military records. "How many wounded did you evacuate in total, Private?" Hayes asked. 16 Americans, sir, and 1 Japanese soldier. We'll leave the enemy casualty out of the report. Focus on American personnel saved. The omission felt like a small betrayal, though Doss understood the reasoning. After-action reports were supposed to quantify American tactical success, not complicate the narrative with accounts of enemy soldiers who'd been treated by American medics and then transferred to prisoner-of-war facilities for proper medical care. "Tell me about the rope," Hayes continued. "How did you determine its load-bearing capacity?" The question revealed how little the official inquiry understood about what had actually happened on the ridge. There had been no engineering calculations, no assessment of weight limits or safety factors, just a piece of hemp salvaged from a supply drop, a dying banyan tree, and faith that sometimes stretched beyond reason. "I didn't determine anything, sir. I just hoped it would hold. But you made 16 separate trips up and down a cliff face under enemy fire. There must have been some systematic evaluation of risk versus—" "Sir," Hayes's aide interrupted, looking up from his typewriter. "We've got preliminary reports from intelligence about enemy positions on the ridge. Might want to hear this before we continue." Hayes nodded, and the aide read from a field report that had arrived that morning. Intelligence teams examining the abandoned Japanese positions had found something unexpected in the caves overlooking the rope anchor point. Clear lines of fire on the cliff face, prepared firing positions, and evidence that enemy soldiers had been watching the American evacuation operation for hours without engaging. According to this, the Japanese could have cut your rope at any time during the operation, the aide continued. They had multiple machine gun positions with direct observation of your anchor point and descent route. The information confirmed what Doss had suspected during his final trips up the rope, but seeing it in an official intelligence report made it feel different, more deliberate. What he'd experienced as a series of near misses and mysteriously inaccurate enemy fire had actually been a conscious choice by Japanese soldiers to allow his rescue operation to continue. "Did you have any indication at the time that enemy forces were deliberately avoiding engagement?" Hayes asked. "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you mention this in your preliminary statement?" The honest answer was too complicated for a military report. How could he explain that enemy soldiers had seemed to understand something sacred about what he was doing, even when his own countrymen questioned the wisdom of climbing that rope again and again? How could he put into official language the strange communion that had developed between himself and the Japanese gunners, watching from the caves? "I wasn't sure what it meant, sir. But that wasn't entirely true either. During his final hour on Hacksaw Ridge, lowering Henderson and the wounded Japanese soldier in their improvised double harness, he'd heard something from the caves above that still haunted his sleep. Not the harsh commands or tactical communications he'd grown used to, but what sounded like voices raised in something approaching prayer. Hayes closed the folder containing preliminary statements and looked directly at Doss. "Off the record, what do you think really happened up there?" The question opened space for the truth that would never appear in any after-action report. The truth about climbing that rope for the first time, hands shaking with fear that had nothing to do with enemy fire and everything to do with the possibility that he might not be strong enough to lower a wounded man safely. The truth about the 7th trip, when the rope was already showing signs of failure and he'd whispered prayers that had less to do with divine intervention than simple human desperation. The truth about standing on that plateau, looking at a wounded Japanese soldier and a wounded American and realizing that the choice between them was no choice at all. "I think they were as tired as we were, sir. I think they'd seen enough dying for one day, just like I had. And maybe they recognized something about trying to save lives instead of taking them." Hayes nodded slowly. "That won't go in the official report." "I understand, sir." But as Doss walked back to his company area that evening, hands still bandaged from rope burns that were taking longer to heal than the medics had expected, he carried with him the knowledge that some truths were too large for official reports and too important for silence. The rope had held just long enough. The Japanese soldiers had shown mercy he couldn't explain, and somewhere between the first trip up that cliff and the last trip down, he'd learned something about courage that had nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with the decision to keep climbing when every rational calculation suggested it was time to stop. 40 years later, Doss stood in his workshop in Georgia, holding a piece of hemp rope he'd saved from a hardware store display. The morning newspaper lay open beside him to an article about the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Okinawa, complete with maps of Hacksaw Ridge and a brief mention of Medal of Honor recipient Desmond Doss, who evacuated 16 wounded soldiers under enemy fire using an improvised rope line. 16 soldiers. The number had become part of the official record, repeated in citation documents and history books. But the arithmetic of memory operated differently than the arithmetic of medals, and Doss found himself thinking about the 17th man, the wounded Japanese soldier who'd been quietly omitted from most accounts of that day on the ridge. His hands, scarred now with 4 decades of rope burns that never quite healed properly, traced the hemp fibers with the automatic precision of someone who'd learned to read rope like other men read books. Tensile strength, load distribution. The subtle signs that warned when cordage was approaching failure. The workshop door opened, and his grandson Tommy entered with the careful quietness that family members used when they found him holding pieces of rope and staring at nothing they could see. "Grandpa, Mom says dinner's ready." "Be right there." But he didn't move immediately. The rope in his hands felt heavier than it should, weighted with memories that never quite faded, even when the official stories grew more polished with each retelling. Tommy was 12 now, old enough to ask hard questions about the war, and young enough to expect honest answers. "Tommy, what would you do if you had to choose between saving 2 people, but you could only save 1? The boy considered the question with the seriousness that children brought to hypothetical moral dilemmas. "I guess I'd try to save both, even if it meant risking all 3 of you. I don't know. Maybe. Why?" Instead of answering directly, Doss set the rope aside and pulled down a wooden box from a high shelf. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, lay the actual piece of hemp he'd cut from the original rope after it finally parted completely on the 4th day of fighting at Hacksaw Ridge. The fiber looked ordinary now. Brown, slightly stiff, no different from 1,000 other pieces of cordage that had served their purpose and been discarded. But Tommy handled it with the reverence that children reserved for artifacts from adult stories they didn't quite understand. This held 16 men. 17, actually. The correction slipped out before Doss could stop it, carrying with it the weight of an omission he'd carried for 4 decades. In all the official accounts, all the interviews and ceremonies and history book passages, he'd allowed the 17th man to disappear from the record. A wounded Japanese soldier who'd needed medical attention just like every wounded American on that ridge. What happened to the 17th man? He lived. They transferred him to a prisoner of war camp after his wounds healed. I never learned his name. What he didn't tell Tommy, what he'd never told anyone, was that he sometimes woke up at night with the sound of rain drumming against canvas tarps and the feel of hemp rope burning through his gloves. Not nightmares exactly, but memories that remained as vivid as yesterday. The weight of 2 men in an improvised harness, the voices calling from the caves above, the strange mercy of enemies who could have cut his lifeline but chose not to. Tommy examined the rope fragment with the careful attention of someone trying to understand how something so ordinary could bear such extraordinary weight. Were you scared? Terrified? Every trip up and down that cliff. But you kept climbing anyway. I kept climbing anyway. The workshop fell quiet except for the sound of evening rain beginning to drum against the tin roof. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the Georgia countryside. But Doss heard instead the voices of wounded men calling for help through smoke and shellfire on a ridge half a world and 4 decades away. "The thing about courage," he told Tommy, "is that it's not about not being afraid. It's about hearing something that matters more than the fear." What did you hear? Voices asking for help. American voices. Japanese voices. In the end, they all sounded the same. Tommy carefully rewrapped the rope fragment and placed it back in its box. "Do you think they remember you? The men you saved?" Some questions carried more weight than a 12-year-old could understand. Doss thought about Henderson, who'd written a letter every Christmas for 15 years before the correspondence gradually faded. About Doc Williams, who died in a car accident in 1963. About Morrison, who'd survived his chest wound but never talked about the war, even at reunions. And somewhere in Japan, if he was still alive, a former soldier who'd spent a few hours as a prisoner of war in an American aid station, receiving medical treatment from the same hands that had treated his enemies. I think they remember what happened that day. Whether they remember me specifically is less important. The rain continued falling, washing across a tin roof in Georgia like it had once washed across coral limestone in Okinawa. Memory and weather, connecting moments across decades with the persistence of water finding its way downhill. "Come on," Tommy said, taking his grandfather's scarred hand in his own smooth one. "Mum's making pot roast." As they walked toward the house, Doss could still feel the phantom weight of hemp rope in his palms, the burn of fibers that had held just long enough, just barely, to carry 17 men from darkness toward light, on a day when the arithmetic of war had briefly yielded to the arithmetic of conscience. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.